The crown prince brought back an orphaned girl, intending to make her his concubine. He said, "I promised her father that I would take care of her for the rest of her life." My dear older brother said, "Her father died in battle. You should be more understanding." Even my parents advised me to be generous. Her background is pitiable. In the end, she's just a concubine, whereas you're different. Later, she and I fell into the water at the same time. Everyone rushed to her, while I drowned in the icy, cold lake. When I was reborn, I broke off the engagement and moved out of the mansion. But they kept appearing before me, eyes red, saying they regretted it. I was pulled into the water by Lu Yuner. She said that His Highness didn't care for me, and if I knew what was good for me, I should go to the emperor and cancel the engagement. I wasn't angry. I just looked at her and said, "Whether he cares or not, let Yen Sun tell me himself." After I said that, I turned and walked toward the shore, but she suddenly grabbed my wrist. "You don't believe me? Then let's see for yourself." She pulled me, and with a splash, jumped into the water. The winter lake was freezing and my vision blurred. Faintly, I heard panicked shouts and footsteps. Then, 2 more splashes sounded. I struggled to open my eyes and saw my fiancé and my brother. They swam desperately toward Lu Yuna, never sparing me a glance. In the final moment before I lost consciousness, I think I heard someone calling my name. But I couldn't respond. Lu Yuner took a dangerous gamble, and she won. As for me, I lost everything. Lu Zheng. My vision cleared, and the suffocating feeling disappeared. I looked up at the source of the voice and saw Yen Sun in front of me. He was riding a horse, and under his black cloak was a woman wrapped up. Lu Yuner's eyes peeked out, timidly looking at me. Before I could speak, she lowered her head, biting her lower lip, and struggled slightly. "Your Highness, please let Yuner down. You're injured. Don't move." He frowned and stopped her. Lu Yuner's face was bright red. She pretended not to notice, looking at me, her eyes full of challenge. My thoughts slowly came back. In this moment, I realized that, just like in the storybooks, I had been reborn to the day when Yen Sun brought Lu Yuner back. Yen Sun and I had grown up together, childhood friends, innocent and carefree. The late emperor brought him to my full moon banquet. He, just learning to speak, came to me and stammered, "Little sister, pretty." The late emperor laughed heartily and decided right then and there that we would marry. Everyone in the capital said I was lucky. The crown prince respected me, my brother spoiled me, and my parents loved me. But all of it was like a bubble, ready to burst with a single poke. Lu Yuner's arrival turned everything upside down. Yen Sun supported her in every way, and we fought many times. He criticized me for not having the demeanor of a crown princess and being unable to accept her. But it was he who made a promise of lifelong companionship. Once a promise is made, shouldn't it be kept? My brother, who had always loved me, quickly tilted the scale in Lu Yuner's favor after her arrival. He repeatedly told me that Lu Yuner was the daughter of a loyal general and I should make way for her and not be unreasonable. I cried and complained to my parents, but they advised me to be magnanimous, not to let jealousy cool Yen Sun's heart. They gained good reputation, while I took all the blame. I didn't understand why, after my death, I returned to the past. But it was a blessing. In my previous life, I wasted my short life on Yen Sun. It wasn't until I died that I realized no one truly loved me. Even familial love was filled with too much interest and calculation. Now that I had been reborn, I wanted to live freely. I ignored Lu Yuner's unfriendly gaze and looked at Yen Sun. The man I once wanted to marry, even at the cost of my life, now felt like a stranger. I realized clearly that after going through life and death, my love for him had disappeared. He probably thought I was going to make a scene again. His expression plainly showed his impatience. But I just stepped aside, giving him a distant smile. "Your Highness, I'm sorry." I bowed gracefully and turned to leave. Not once did I look back at him. When I returned to the mansion, I saw my brother in his official robes walking toward me. He called out to me from behind, then stopped in front of me. Although we had seen each other just hours ago, it felt like a lifetime apart. I don't know what he was thinking when he indirectly caused my death for Liu Yun'er. Did he feel any remorse? I also don't know if the voice I heard calling my name before I died was his. I heard you stopped the crown prince's horse? I nodded. Because the crown prince brought back an orphan girl? I shook my head, but he didn't wait for my explanation. He just sneered. Mother said you're too thoughtful. I didn't believe her at first, but now it seems she was right. General Liu fought bravely on the battlefield, dying in battle. Miss Liu is his only daughter. His Highness brought her back to honor General Liu's spirit and to show the royal family's kindness. Don't let some childish emotions cause His Highness to feel hurt. I opened my mouth, wanting to say something, but in the end, said nothing. The same thing had already happened once. But reliving it, my heart still felt pricked, as if stabbed by thousands of needles, leaving me breathless. Yen's son arrived in the evening, and he brought Liu Yun'er with him. I really didn't want to see him, but my mother came to persuade me, and I'd already heard enough of her endless moralizing. I figured it was better to face Yen's son and clear the air. When I got there, he was standing by the pond with Liu Yun'er feeding the fish. She wore a soft yellow gown, looking so innocent and carefree, her eyes filled with affection as they followed him. I didn't want to interrupt them, but Yen's son spotted me. His eyes lit up immediately as he hurried over. Yet in the very next moment, Liu Yun'er clutched his sleeve, huddling behind him like a startled little creature, refusing to budge even an inch. It was as if, in her eyes, I were a man-eating beast. He had no choice but to pause and comfort her. But no amount of soothing worked. Her tears kept falling, and she panicked, trying desperately to break free. So he wrapped her in his arms, and only then did she finally calm down. I stood aside, watching it all unfold with a cool detachment. After a long while, he seemed to notice I was still there, and a look of guilt crossed his face. Liu Zheng, he called out. He intended to let her go, but then Liu Yun'er suddenly dropped to her knees right before him. Your Highness, if my father, who died valiantly on the battlefield, won't have me, will you also reject me? She pleaded. Sure enough, mentioning her fallen father softened Yen's son's heart. During those days on the frontier, Yun'er lived in constant fear. It was your Highness who rescued her from that dreadful place. Please, don't forsake her, she continued, her tears mingling with her sobs in a way that made her all the more pitiable. Yen's son helped her up and patiently comforted her. Out of his sight, she flashed me a smug smile. I couldn't help but find it amusing. Here she was, once from a proud family, now content to be trapped behind high walls and embroiled in court intrigues. How tragic. I simply stood there and waited. After a while, she burst into a giggle. I really thought that your Highness was going to hand me over to Miss Xia as a maid. Seeing her such innocent, he couldn't help but laugh along. He wiped away the tears at the corner of her eyes, then turned to me. Liu Zheng, Yun'er got frightened. I'll take her back for now, and I'll come see you tomorrow. Under the moonlight, their figures leaned close together. I watched their retreating backs and coolly said, Your Highness, don't come back. He turned to look at me, clearly puzzled. I repeated, Yen's son, don't come back. He seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Liu Zheng, stop fooling around. I shook my head firmly. I'm not fooling around. Let's call off our engagement. I meant the cancellation for Liu Yun'er. Everyone knew about my engagement to Yen's son. It was even celebrated as a fairy tale romance. It wasn't something that could be undone with just a few casual words from me. I only said it to push Liu Yun'er to act faster. She was ambitious. She refused to be relegated to the position of a secondary consort. That's why, in my previous life, she had insisted that I be the one to call off the engagement. That way, she could become the crown princess. Now, I was putting the opportunity right in front of her. I needed her to secure Yen's son for me, even if it was just a tiny bit of affection from him. As long as he felt even the slightest fondness for her, that would be enough. That way, when I finally proposed to break off the engagement, everything would go much more smoothly. I was waiting for the right chance. It had been half a month since I first mentioned breaking off the engagement. The day I brought it up, Yen Sun thought I was throwing a tantrum and got furious. After that, he never came looking for me. I figured he was probably waiting for me to come to him and apologize. After all, throughout our lives, I was always the one to back down first. I used to believe that when two people truly loved each other, such things wouldn't matter. But later I realized that refusing to compromise just meant you didn't love the other person enough. He was bound to be disappointed. From now on, I wouldn't be the one to seek him out. Then came the concubine's birthday, and the palace held a banquet. Yen Sun had someone deliver a set of exquisite pearl hair ornaments to me. He didn't say a word, but after decades together, I knew his heart inside out. He was simply compromising with me in his own way. After accepting the ornaments, I promptly handed them over, untouched, to Lu Yuner. That same evening, I entered the palace with my family. Yen Sun had been waiting for me at the palace gate, but when he saw that I wasn't wearing the set he had given me, his face instantly darkened. He swept his sleeve aside and strode off. My mother poked my waist and asked, "Did you have a row with the crown prince?" I shook my head. She smiled and reached out to support my arm. I sidestepped, and her hand fell empty. I couldn't ignore the fleeting look of confusion and helplessness in her eyes, but it didn't make me feel the slightest bit wistful. I thought to myself, my bond with her, a bond of mother and daughter, was over for good in this life. Consort Li was in the height of her favor, and the banquet was grand. The palace was brightly lit, like daylight. Exotic women dressed in thin gauze, holding bells, danced gracefully to the music. Yen Sun sat directly across from me, with Lu Yuner behind him. The set of pearl headpieces was indeed worn by her. While everyone was distracted drinking, I slipped away to the outer hall. Unexpectedly, Yen Sun followed me out. Having drunk, he looked at me with some grievance in his eyes. "Why aren't you talking to me?" I looked at him. "The matter of breaking off the engagement, I am serious about it." "Why?" He grabbed my wrist, urgently questioning. I shook my head. "It's just that I've suddenly realized Your Highness is not a good match for me." He froze for a moment, then sneered. "Not a good match? Xia Luzheng, you're quite something." He shook off my hand and strode back toward the inner hall. I let out a sigh of relief. Before long, palace maids began bringing in delicious dishes one after another. The last maid had her head lowered, a clear birthmark behind her ear. My heart raced. I knew the opportunity had arrived. In my previous life, at Consort Li's birthday banquet, an assassin had appeared. The emperor was injured in the attack, severely wounding him, though it didn't threaten his life. The assassin failed and bit down on the poison hidden in their teeth, dying on the spot. The emperor was enraged and sent Yen Sun to investigate. Later, it was discovered that the assassin had some connection to General Liu, who had died on the battlefield. But at the time, Yen Sun and I had grown increasingly distant, while he developed feelings for Lu Yuner. To avoid affecting Lu Yuner, he decided to keep this matter secret and claimed the assassin was from the remnants of the previous dynasty. The issue was quickly swept under the rug. This time, I decided to save the emperor and use this to earn a favor for myself. As for the maid, I was determined to save her and uncover the truth. I took a deep breath, acting casual as I followed the maid back into the inner hall. The performance had ended, and the actors were quietly retreating, heads lowered. The emperor held a wine cup, his face flushed with color. He stood and walked to the center of the stage, with Consort Li softly leaning beside him. The ministers and their families in the audience sat up straight. In the moment of distraction, the maid moved closer to the emperor, brushing past him. In that instant, a cold glint flashed. "Your Majesty, be careful." I seized the opportunity, lunging forward and taking the blow myself. Blood immediately stained my sleeve. Seeing her assassination fail, the maid's beautiful eyes were filled with unwillingness and despair. It seemed she had made a decision, slowly closing her eyes. I realized she was planning to commit suicide, and without thinking of the pain, I tackled her to the ground, tightly covering her mouth. "She has poison in her mouth." The guards quickly reacted and restrained her. The poison in her mouth was removed. I let out a sigh of relief and unintentionally met her gaze. Her look was full of hatred. I wanted to say something, but I knew the time was not right. When I regained my composure, I saw Yen-sun, my brother, and my parents all gathered around me. My mother was in a panic, unsure whether to wipe the blood from my wound or to avoid hurting me, tears brimming in her eyes. My daughter, Lu Zheng, what should we do? What should we do? My father and brother furrowed their brows, but their eyes were full of concern. Yen-sun's face was dark as he whispered in my ear, "Have you lost your mind?" At that moment, the imperial physicians rushed in a hurry. He grabbed one of the physicians and tossed him in front of me. "Examine her." Thankfully, the wound was only superficial and didn't harm anything vital, so it wasn't serious. They all breathed a sigh of relief. I looked toward Lu Yuner's position but found her staring at the maid's back, her face pale, nearly collapsing. The assassination attempt was quickly suppressed. I was praised for guarding the emperor and was reassigned to a new position. At last, the emperor, sitting high above, turned his gaze toward me. My breath quickened, and a thin layer of sweat formed on my back. "Lu Zheng, you saved the emperor today. I grant you 3 favors." It had come, finally. The moment the emperor's words fell, I dropped to my knees. "Your Majesty is wise and brilliant. I have an unworthy request. Please show mercy and annul my engagement with His Highness, the Crown Prince." At these words, the room erupted in shock. Yen-sun, disregarding protocol, grabbed my wrist angrily. "Xiao Lu Zheng." The emperor, sitting high on his throne, also darkened his expression. "Crown Prince." Yen-sun froze, released my hand, and knelt on the ground. The emperor turned his gaze toward me. "Lu Zheng, do you understand what you're saying?" The emperor's gaze was cold and imposing. I stood firm under the immense pressure, meeting his eyes. "Everything Lu Zheng says is from the heart." I knew this request would cause the royal family to lose face. But today was my only chance. If I compromised, I would face the same fate as in my previous life. The feeling of being drowned was unbearable. My father trembled with rage. My mother stared at me in confusion, as if she didn't recognize me anymore. The room was silent. After a long pause, the emperor's authoritative voice rang out again. "I permit it." Yen-sun looked up, staring at the emperor in disbelief. "Father." He tried to speak, but was silenced by the emperor's gaze. In the end, his head, which had been held high, lowered once again. His whole body seemed to slump, as though he had aged 10 years. "My second request, Your Majesty, is that you allow me to fully participate in the investigation of today's assassination attempt." I pretended to smile bitterly. After all, today, I nearly lost my life. The emperor's gaze softened slightly. "I permit it." I kneeled, folded my hands, and bowed deeply. "May Your Majesty live for 10,000 years, with the sun and moon shining together." 2 of my 3 wishes were granted. As for the third wish, I didn't plan on using it just yet. The banquet ended early, and I stood up from the ground. My legs were a bit numb from kneeling for so long. Lu Yuner rushed forward and tried to support Yen-sun, but he forcefully pushed her away. "Your Highness, Your Highness." She looked at him, full of grievance. But Yen-sun didn't even look at her. He glared at me with hatred. "Xiao Lu Zheng, you're truly heartless." I took a step back. "The past is nothing but smoke. I wish you, Your Highness, could soon find someone who truly understands you and grow old together." I said these words while casually glancing at Lu Yuner. She met my gaze, and her eyes were filled with determination. When leaving the palace, my parents and brother had already left in a carriage, punishing me for my rash decisions. I was left standing alone at the palace gate. I wasn't angry, just tired since it was quite a distance to walk home. Not far into my walk, I heard the sound of horse hooves behind me. I stepped aside, but the carriage stopped right in front of me. A pair of fair, delicate hands lifted the curtain, revealing a captivating face. Jing Wang Yanjin. Unlike Yen-sun, Yanjin was nearly invisible in the capital. His mother was a low-ranking consort who passed away young. At the age of 15, Yanjin was made Jing Wang and sent far away to his fief. He seemed like his title, quiet and calm. He only returned to the capital for festivals. But in my previous life, at this time, he hadn't returned. I pondered this in my heart, but couldn't come to any conclusion. He seemed unexpectedly familiar. "Miss Xie, if you don't mind, I can give you a ride." I was about to refuse, but his next words made it impossible. "It's late, and as a young lady, traveling alone isn't safe." I thought about it for a moment and nodded. "Then I'll trouble Prince Jing." The banquet attire was cumbersome and not easy to move in. I lifted my skirt, unsure how to move. A large hand appeared in front of me, and I looked up to see Yanjin's gentle face. "Why are you standing still?" "Thank you." I extended my hand. He seemed thin, but his hand was warm. Once seated in the carriage, he took a box of pastries from a compartment and placed them on the table. Cloud flake pastries from Ju Fuji. My eyes brightened. "How did you know I liked Ju Fuji's cloud flake pastries?" I immediately realized my words were a bit off. Fortunately, he didn't seem to mind. What a coincidence, I like them too. His eyes shone like the spring waters in March. I flushed and lowered my gaze, focusing on the pastries instead. I've heard that the relationship between the Crown Prince and Miss Xie is quite deep, but from what I see today, it doesn't seem like it. His words were casual, but my heart caught. I paused and replied, "It's just rumors." "There's no possibility between me and the Crown Prince," I added. For some reason, when I said that, Yanjin's presence seemed even more tranquil and warm. He didn't ask further, and the atmosphere in the carriage became quite cozy. I must have dozed off, for when I woke up, we had already reached the estate. I thanked him and was about to step down from the carriage when I heard his voice behind me. "The maid involved in today's assassination attempt, I have some leads. If you're interested, Miss Xie, I'll be at Tingyan Pavilion tomorrow at Shenshi." I turned around, but he had already closed his eyes. I suppressed my curiosity and said nothing more. When I returned home, my parents and brother were waiting for me in the main house. As soon as he saw me, my father threw the teacup in his hand at me. I quickly dodged, and the teacup shattered on the floor. Unfilial daughter. Kneel. If it had been before, I would have kneeled down, trembling, begging for forgiveness. But now, what have I done wrong? Why should I kneel? I stubbornly stood my ground, not moving. My mother rushed over to me, her face full of anxiety. "Don't act spoiled now. Quickly kneel and apologize. Tomorrow, go apologize to the Crown Prince. Maybe he won't hold it against you, and you can still become the Crown Princess." "But I don't want to be the Crown Princess anymore." She suddenly slapped me across the face. "What nonsense are you talking? Do you even care about me or your father and brother? If the Crown Prince becomes estranged from your brother because of this, your brother's career will be ruined."
I thought she was worried about me.
But no, she was just worried about how it would affect my brother's future. In the past, when relatives joked that a married daughter is like spilled water, my mother would always hold my hand and say, "That's not true. Our Xie Luzheng is my precious heart." I wanted to ask her, "Have you forgotten what you once said?" No one cared about my thoughts. No one cared if I lived or died. The people before me felt more and more unfamiliar. I opened my mouth. "Father, mother, if you're worried that I'll affect the family, why don't we sever our father-daughter relationship?" The room fell into an eerie silence. After a long while, my mother clutched her chest and pointed at me, shock in her eyes, but she didn't say anything. My father shook his sleeves angrily. "Do you think I wouldn't dare?" I turned and walked away. My brother chased after me. "You've changed." I looked up at him. "I haven't. I've just experienced life and death, and I see the people around me clearly now. If no one is planning for me, then I'll plan for myself. If no one loves me, then I'll love myself. Are you worried that the prince will distance himself from you because of this?" He furrowed his brows. "Luzheng, I never wanted to take advantage of you." I nodded. "That's best." Perhaps my gaze was too cold, without any dependence or admiration for him, and he froze in place. After I walked a little farther, I faintly heard his voice behind me. When did you change? When exactly did you change? Ting Yun Pavilion is the largest tea house in the capital. Here, no matter who you are, even those from all walks of life, if you have enough money, you can buy any piece of information you desire. In my previous life, Yen Sun worked tirelessly to gain control of this place, but the mastermind behind it was shrouded in mystery. After years of effort with no results, he eventually had to give up. I had barely stepped into the main hall when a page approached me. "Miss, this way, please." I followed him upstairs and was led into a private room. Outside, the noise was chaotic, but in here, everything was unnaturally quiet. Seated by the table was Yen Jin, calmly preparing tea over a brazier. His movements were as graceful as flowing clouds, and the rising steam created an almost ethereal atmosphere. Truly, he was like a banished, immortal descended into our mortal world. "Miss Xia, please have a seat," he said. I did as instructed and sat down. He then handed me a cup of tea. This tea is called Qingming Dream. It can only be harvested on Qingming Day each year, and once the sun rises, you can't pick any more. "Please, Miss Xia, have a taste." I nudged the cup lightly and asked, "And what does this have to do with the assassination attempt?" He smiled and replied, "I heard that His Highness the Crown Prince recently brought back an orphan." I felt a twinge of anger. Is that all His Highness Jing Wang has been scheming about? I stood up to leave, but he quickly stepped forward and blocked my path. "Why are you so impatient?" he chided as he lightly tapped my head. I felt insulted and was about to retort when he continued, "Lu Yuner, she's that tea-picking girl." I stared at him. "Isn't she supposed to be General Lu's daughter?" He shook his head. "General Lu's daughter? She's still confined in the dungeon." The news Yen Jin had just delivered was utterly preposterous, yet upon reflection, it made a strange kind of sense. No wonder Lu Yuner had turned pale and frantic when she saw that palace maid. It turns out she was an imposter. In my previous life, Lu Yuner's behavior hadn't exactly been that of a proper gentlewoman. She claimed that growing up on the frontier meant she'd never learned all these refined formalities, a story that, admittedly, held water. Then it struck me. When Yen Sun investigated in my past life, he uncovered all these facts, yet he concealed them for Lu Yuner's sake. That is nothing short of a crime against the sovereign. For her, Yen Sun was willing to go to any lengths. Suppressing the bitterness in my heart, I asked, "What exactly is going on?"
He shook his head.
"I'm still investigating the details. The main problem right now is that there's simply no evidence. I need your help." I met his gaze. "How can you help?" Later, I encountered the real Lu Yuner in the dungeon. The emperor had yet to decide who would investigate this case, so for now, she was merely being held there. To prevent her from attempting suicide again, the guards had her bound to a wooden frame. Though they hadn't tortured her severely, it was obvious she was suffering. When she saw me, she lifted her eyes for a moment, then snorted dismissively and closed them again. "I know who you are." "Lu Yuner," I said. Barely had the words left my mouth before she scoffed, looked up, and declared, "My name is Yun Yao. You've got me wrong." The flickering light revealed her face, a healthy, sun-kissed complexion with willow-like brows and a striking, spirited look. "I will clear your name," I promised. After speaking, I left the dungeon and made my way to the Eastern Palace. At the gate, a guard recognized me. "Miss Xia, are you here to see His Highness?" Feigning panic, I stammered, I have urgent business with His Highness." He replied, "But His Highness has been sent out of the city on imperial orders and won't be back at the Eastern Palace until tomorrow. If you have something to say, you can tell me now and I'll pass it on when he returns." I bit my lip and, glancing over the palace, spotted a woman standing in the corridor, someone pretending to be Lu Yuner. Our eyes met, and I couldn't help but sneer. "No need. Since His Highness isn't here, I'll have a word with Miss Lu," I said coolly. As I walked toward her, each step seemed to drain a bit more color from her face. When I was close enough, I looked down at her haughtily. I went to the dungeon today. Her face lost all color, yet her tone remained defiant. So what? I smiled thinly. Once the assassination case is fully investigated, do you really think you'll have any chance of survival? I don't know what you're talking about. His Highness will be back soon, and I still have to prepare soup for him. I won't be joining you. After saying that, she turned to flee. I covered my mouth and laughed mockingly. Didn't His Highness tell you? He's out on official business today and won't return until tomorrow. It seems His Highness's regard for you is just as shallow. She stood frozen for a moment. I've known that for a long time, she mumbled. I watched her retreat hastily, deep in thought. That very night, word spread throughout the palace that the orphan brought back by the crown prince had illegally broken into the dungeon. She was caught red-handed by Jing Wang. I later heard that Jing Wang had been summoned by the emperor for dinner that very evening. After the meal, the emperor insisted on discussing matters with Jing Wang. By the time Jing Wang left, it was well past midnight. Halfway through his return, he suddenly spotted a furtive figure in a palace corridor. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was none other than General Lu's daughter, Lu Yuner. Not daring to delay, Jing Wang immediately brought her before the emperor. Under intense questioning, Lu Yuner admitted that it was His Highness the Crown Prince who had sent her to the dungeon to spy on the would-be assassin. The emperor was incensed and immediately recalled the Crown Prince, who was still out of the city. The Crown Prince rushed back overnight and, to everyone's surprise, admitted to the matter. Kneeling before the emperor, he said, Lu Yuner is General Lu's daughter. Having grown up in the military, she's learned a few interrogation techniques. I thought I'd let her try to get the assassin to talk so that the investigation could be wrapped up swiftly. He continued, I acted too hastily out of concern, and I'm willing to accept any punishment. Punishment, of course, was out of the question. After all, the emperor had high hopes for Yen Sun. Yet the majesty of the Son of Heaven does not tolerate defiance. Moreover, Yen Sun's actions overstepped his bounds. With the emperor in good health, how could he possibly be the one giving orders? Thus, Jing Wang, who had been dozing nearby, was suddenly entrusted with full responsibility for the assassination case, while the crown prince was barred from any involvement. As for Lu Yuner, being the daughter of a loyal minister, the emperor could not harshly punish her. Instead, she was ordered to reflect quietly in the Eastern Palace, which was essentially house arrest. Yen Jin recounted everything to me in vivid detail. I could almost picture Yen Sun looking utterly defeated, and I felt so pleased that I burst out laughing. But as I laughed, I gradually sensed something was off. That fake Lu Yuner went to the dungeon solely because my words yesterday made her anxious. It couldn't possibly have been Yen Sun's orders, I mused. I know him well enough. He's inherently selfish and wouldn't take the blame for something as trivial as a little affection for a counterfeit Lu Yunu. There must be some hidden details behind it. I'll need you, Prince Jing, to verify this for me. But instead of answering, he furrowed his brow and asked, You say you know him? How well do you really know him? His tone carried a hint of jealousy, though I quickly dismissed that thought. Yen Jin and I hardly ever cross paths, so he wouldn't be getting jealous on my behalf. Growing up together naturally means I understand him a bit better than most, I replied. But that's all in the past now. He nodded in satisfaction. From now on, just call me Yen Jin. Before I could even react, he stuffed a piece of cloud flake pastry into my mouth. Whatever I had planned to say vanished in an instant. My heart began pounding a bit, but his calm and natural expression made me feel like I'd been overthinking things. Yen Jin and I worked from dawn till dusk, yet we uncovered very little. Logically, the fake Lu Yuner was nothing more than a tea-picking girl. By her own means, she couldn't have orchestrated something so flawlessly. There had to be someone else pulling the strings behind her. At first, I suspected that enemy state forces were involved. But as our investigation deepened, I began to doubt Yen Sun. He was the crown prince, resourceful and capable. Yet if he were responsible, finding evidence would be nearly impossible. The breakthrough had to come from the real Lu Yuner. But before we could question her, she was poisoned. The genuine Lu Yun'er was dead. She left behind a blood-written letter confessing her sins. In it, she claimed that she was from the Jinling Yun family, a clan of the previous dynasty that had been entirely exterminated for supporting its remnants. Who would have thought there was one who had slipped through? Her poison had been concealed in the crevices of her fingernails, which is why it went undetected. With a motive for the assassination now in place, everything fit together perfectly, with no obvious loophole. But I knew that all of this was just part of the mastermind's design. The case was wrapped up hastily. Yan Jin had to return to his fief. Before he left, he looked at me apologetically and said, "I'm sorry." I simply shook my head. Since my rebirth, I've been fighting on my own. If he could accompany me for this stretch, I was more than satisfied. I watched Yan Jin's caravan slowly fade into the distance and then turn to descend the city wall. At the foot of the wall, I encountered Yan Sun waiting as usual. We stood in the wind in silence. After a long while, he walked toward me, his face ghostly pale. "Lu Zheng, have you fallen in love with someone else?" he asked. I let out a cold laugh. "I'm not like your highness. I'm not so fickle." I passed by him, but he grabbed my sleeve. His expression was pained, his eyes full of pleading. "Lu Zheng, could you wait for me just a little longer?" Then he added, "I swear, you've always been the only one in my heart." I brushed his hand away, word for word saying, "Your Highness, you really disgust me." His grip suddenly slackened, and he seemed as if he'd lost his soul. Unable to stand, he collapsed to the ground. Those eyes, once filled with heroic ambition, were now utterly empty. I never gave up on investigating Lu Yun'er's case. But without Yan Jin's support, as a lone woman, every step became more arduous. Yet again, the day ended with nothing to show for it. As I dragged my exhausted body home, an unexpected turn of events occurred. A group of masked men in black charged toward me. My heart tightened, but before I could flee, another group appeared. The two sides clashed, and the men in black were quickly overpowered. I leaned against a wall, still trembling with residual fear. At that moment, Yan Sun appeared. He rushed to me, grabbed my arms, and checked me over to ensure I was unharmed before finally exhaling in relief. I asked, "Have you been following me all along to protect me?" He managed a wry smile. "I was just worried you might get hurt. If you don't like it, I won't show up around you in the future," he explained anxiously. I sighed and was about to reply when a man in black suddenly charged at me. A long sword was thrust straight toward my heart. In the blink of an eye, Yan Sun stepped in front of me. I heard the sickening sound of a blade piercing flesh as blood gushed out. His face turned as white as paper. "Lu Zheng, don't be afraid." I don't recall how I managed to get him back to the Eastern Palace. The imperial physicians swarmed around him, and bowl after bowl of blood was brought out. Lu Yun'er, fuming with resentment, stood before me and shouted, "You jinx!" She raised her hand as if to hit me, but I stood frozen. Then a voice from behind declared, "Enough." The emperor arrived with his retinue. His gaze upon me was ice cold. Soon after, my father, my mother, and my brother appeared. People bustled around, yet I heard nothing. All I could see was Yan Sun's face, repeating over and over in my mind. I can't recall how long I stood there, through darkness into dawn, and from dawn back to dusk, until I finally heard a physician say, "His Highness the Crown Prince is blessed, and his life is secure. There's nothing serious." With that, the long-held breath within me was finally released. My vision went black, and I collapsed, losing consciousness. When I awoke again, it was already the afternoon of the next day. I didn't even bother putting on my shoes as I ran to Yan Sun's room. He happened to open his eyes, and our gazes met. Then, ignoring the pain on his body, he struggled to sit up and made his way to me. He looked at me, crying one moment, laughing the next. After a long while, he rushed forward and pulled me tightly into his arms. "Lu Zheng, you're still alive." In that moment, my heart sank into the depths. He too had been reborn. Everything was tangled together like a knotted ball of yarn, impossible to cut apart or unravel. It had been several days since Yen's son had woken up. Ever since our last meeting, I hadn't dared see him again. Yet he took the initiative to summon me. Emotionally, he had saved my life. Logically, he's the crown prince while I'm merely the daughter of a minister. In any case, I had to see him. I packed up at home, and my mother escorted me to the door. She looked rather pleased as she said, "Ah Zheng, I can tell that His Highness truly cares for you. After everything you've been through, don't throw a tantrum now." I wanted to explain that saving my life was one thing, but breaking off the engagement was something entirely different. I knew, however, that she wouldn't understand. The Eastern Palace carriage waited outside, and once I boarded, the ride was smooth. Soon enough, I saw Yen's son. He was so overjoyed to see me that he barely even noticed the wounds on his body. "Lu Zheng," he called. I nodded slightly and replied coolly, "Your Highness." He hesitated a moment, then gestured for everyone to leave. Before long, the room was empty except for the two of us. At last, he asked the question, "Lu Zheng, you've returned too, haven't you?" I met his gaze and answered, "Yes." He looked flustered. "Lu Zheng, please let me explain. I didn't refuse to save you, it was Lu Yuner. She was wearing your clothes, and I mistook her for you." "My clothes?" I echoed. He nodded, then continued, "That outfit on her was specially made by an embroiderer for you. But one of the maids misunderstood and delivered it to her room, thinking it was meant for Lu Yuner. In the chaos, I couldn't see your faces clearly and had to rely on the clothes to recognize you. I never imagined." His voice choked, and his eyes reddened. "I never intended to be the cause of your death." I opened my mouth, not knowing where to begin. Although it was a misunderstanding, the previous quarrels and cold stares were real, his change of heart, and the grievances I suffered were all genuine. How could everything simply be wiped away? Bitterly, I said, "Your Highness, the bond between us is over. Don't force it." After speaking, I bowed gracefully and began to step back. But he suddenly blocked me. "I'm going to force it. Lu Zheng, I know there's resentment in your heart. I'll have Lu Yuner give you an explanation," he said, his eyes turning ice cold. I didn't know exactly what he was planning, but I figured it was something to do with the fake Lu Yuner. Sure enough, a few days later, the fake Lu Yuner vanished. The very heavens over the capital were about to change. The Mid-Autumn Festival arrived as scheduled. The emperor held a grand banquet, and the entire nation celebrated, not only to mark the joyous reunion but also to celebrate that the crown prince had recovered from his injuries. During this time, Yen's son had helped the emperor with numerous matters, each executed flawlessly, earning the emperor's deep favor. The emperor, holding his wine cup, was radiant with joy. But soon, his cup slipped from his hand, and he fell back. He desperately tried to lift his hand, but to no avail. Meanwhile, the ministers below were as silent as crickets, too afraid to rise in protest. Yen's son calmly sipped a cup of wine, then rose from his seat and slowly made his way to the emperor. He studied the old emperor on the dragon throne intently. "Father, you're getting old." The emperor's eyes widened in disbelief as he glared at him. A guttural sound escaped his throat, and he looked utterly enraged. "The army of 100,000 is already assembled outside the city." He turned around and addressed the assembled ministers. The sensible ones immediately knelt, exclaiming, "Hail to the new emperor." The rest exchanged glances, and eventually, all knelt down. I remained seated, unmoving. My father tugged at my sleeve. "Lu Zheng, kneel down quickly." But before he could finish, Yen's son came over to me. He extended his hand toward me, his eyes filled with hope. "Lu Zheng." I looked up and said, "Yen's son, what you're doing is treason." He burst into laughter, as if hearing a joke. "Treason? I only believe in the saying, 'Winners write history.' Lu Zheng, everything I've done has been for you. If you're willing." "She's not willing." Yen Jin then strode in with a group of men. He shot me a scornful glance, a look that mixed displeasure with a hint of grievance. Yen's son furrowed his brow. "Prince Jing, Why are you meddling in the capital when you should be minding your own business? I'm here to stop you, of course, Yan Jin replied. Yan Sun laughed again. Stop me? With you? Yan Jin nodded. I can't do it, so what about her? He clapped his hands, and from the darkness emerged a slender, tall figure who eventually stopped in front of Yan Sun. Lu Yun, weren't you dead? The real Lu Yuner sneered contemptuously. Thanks to your highness, I'm still very much alive, living for my father, for the 5,000 soldiers on the frontier, and for the thousands of souls you've sent to their deaths. How dare you, guards? Yan Sun shouted. But no one came. Guards, I said, come. Lu Yuner laughed. Crown Prince, the 100,000 troops under your command are my Lu family army, trained with my father's blood, sweat, and tears. And what right do you have to assume that once I appear, they'll continue to take orders from you? Back then, you colluded with the enemy and committed treason. My father discovered it, but because you were young, he covered it up for you. Yet you joined forces with the enemy, luring my father and 5,000 troops into a trap. Over 70 members of the Lu family perished, and more than 5,000 of our soldiers were lost on the frontier. By heaven's grace, I clawed my way out of that sea of corpses and blood. I, Lu Yuna, have come today to take my revenge on you. She raised her sword and charged straight at Yan Sun, but he dodged her attack. Everything is fake. All of it is fake. Guards, seize them all. Yan Sun completely lost his mind. Cornered by Lu Yunu, he collapsed to the ground. All the traitors were captured and thrown into prison. The imperial physicians rushed forward to examine the emperor, but he had been poisoned too deeply. Saving his life wouldn't restore his ability to speak. Yan Jin assumed regency. Everything became so entangled, like a mess of unruly threads, impossible to untangle. It had been several days since Yan Sun awoke. Since our last meeting, I had not dared see him again, but now he had summoned me. Emotionally, he had saved my life. Logically, he is the crown prince while I'm merely the daughter of a minister. Either way, I had to see him. I tidied up at home, and my mother saw me off at the door. She looked delighted, saying, Ah Zheng, I can tell His Highness truly cares for you. After all you've been through, don't act up now. I wanted to tell her that saving my life was one thing, but breaking off the engagement was another, but I knew she wouldn't understand. The Eastern Palace carriage awaited outside, and once I got on, the ride was smooth. Before long, I met Yan Sun. He was so happy to see me that he didn't even tend to his wounds. Lu Zheng, he said. I nodded slightly and replied coolly, Your Highness. He paused, then signaled for everyone to leave until only the two of us remained in the room. Finally, he asked, Lu Zheng, you've returned too, haven't you? I looked at him and said, Yes. He seemed a bit flustered. Lu Zheng, please listen to my explanation. I didn't fail to save you, it was Lu Yuner. She was wearing your clothes, and I mistook her for you. My clothes? He nodded. That outfit on her was specially made for you, by an embroiderer. But one of the maids misunderstood and delivered it to her room, thinking it was meant for Lu Yuner. In the rush, I couldn't see your faces clearly and had to rely on the clothes to identify you. I never expected this. His voice choked up as his eyes reddened. I never intended to be the cause of your death. I opened my mouth, unsure of what to say. Though it was a misunderstanding, the previous quarrels and cold stares were real, as was his change of heart and the grievances I endured. They couldn't simply be swept away. Bitterly, I said, Your Highness, our fate is over, don't force it. After speaking, I bowed slightly and stepped back. But he suddenly blocked me. I'm going to force it. Lu Zheng, I know you harbor resentment. I'll have Lu Yuner give you a proper account, he said, his gaze turning cold. I wasn't sure what he planned, but I suspected it involved the fake Lu Yuner. Sure enough, a few days later, the fake Lu Yuner vanished. The very skies over the capital were about to change. The Mid-Autumn Festival arrived as promised. The emperor held a lavish banquet, and the whole nation celebrated, both to honor the festival of reunion and to celebrate that the crown prince had recovered from his injuries. During this time, Yan Sun had assisted the emperor with numerous affairs. each handled flawlessly, earning him the emperor's deep favor. The emperor, raising his wine cup, looked joyfully radiant. But soon, his cup slipped from his hand and fell, and he staggered backward. He desperately tried to raise his hand, but it was futile. The ministers below were as silent as frozen crickets, too terrified to rise in protest. Yen Sun nonchalantly sipped his wine, then rose and steadily walked toward the emperor. He examined the old emperor on the dragon throne closely. "Father, you are getting old." The emperor's eyes widened in disbelief as he glared at him. A hoarse sound emerged from his throat, and he appeared utterly enraged. "An army of 100,000 has already assembled outside the city." He turned and addressed the assembly of ministers. Sensible ministers immediately knelt, exclaiming, "Hail to the new emperor." The others exchanged glances, and eventually, all of them knelt. I, however, remained seated. My father tugged at my sleeve. "Lu Zheng, kneel down now." But before he could finish, Yen Sun approached me, extending his hand with hopeful eyes. "Lu Zheng," he pleaded. I looked up and said, "Yen Sun, what you're doing is treason." He laughed heartily, as if amused by a joke. "Treason? I only believe in the saying, 'Winners write history.' Lu Zheng, everything I've done has been for you. If you're willing." "She's not willing." Then Yan Jin arrived with a group of men, striding purposefully. He shot me a withering look, a glance that conveyed both displeasure and a touch of wounded pride. Yen Sun furrowed his brow. "Prince Jing, why are you meddling in the capital when you should be minding your own business?" "Of course I'm here to stop you," Yan Jin retorted. Yen Sun laughed again. "Stop me? With you?" Yan Jin nodded. "I can't do it, so what about her?" He clapped his hands, and a slender, tall figure emerged from the darkness, eventually stopping in front of Yen Sun. Lu Yuner, weren't you dead?" The real Lu Yuner sneered contemptuously. "Thanks to your highness, I'm still very much alive, living for my father, for the 5,000 soldiers on the frontier, and for the thousands of souls your blade has claimed." "How dare you?" "Guards!" Yen Sun bellowed. But no one came. "Guards," I said, "come." Lu Yuner laughed. "Crown Prince, the 100,000 troops under your command are my Lu family army, trained with my father's blood, sweat, and tears. And on what grounds do you think that once I appear, they'll continue to take orders from you? Back then, you colluded with the enemy and committed treason. My father discovered it, but because you were young, he covered it up for you. Yet you joined forces with the enemy, luring my father and 5,000 troops into a trap. Over 70 members of the Lu family perished, and more than 5,000 of our soldiers were lost on the frontier. By heaven's grace, I clawed my way out of that sea of corpses and blood. I, Lu Yuna, have come today to take revenge on you." She raised her sword and charged at Yen Sun, but he dodged her attack. "Everything is fake. It's all fake. Guards, seize them all." Yen Sun completely lost his mind. Cornered by Lu Yun'er, he collapsed onto the ground. All the traitors were captured and thrown into prison. The imperial physicians rushed forward to examine the emperor, but he had been poisoned too deeply. Saving his life wouldn't restore his ability to speak. Yan Jin then assumed the role of regent. All these events became so intertwined, like a mass of tangled threads that couldn't be cut or sorted. It had been several days since Yen Sun woke up. Ever since our last meeting, I hadn't seen him, until now when he summoned me. Emotionally, he had saved my life. Logically, he is the crown prince while I am merely the daughter of a minister. No matter what, I had to see him. I prepared myself at home, and my mother saw me off at the door. She looked quite pleased. "Ah, Zheng, I can tell that His Highness truly cares for you. After everything that's happened, don't be unreasonable." I wanted to tell her that saving my life was one matter, but breaking off the engagement was an entirely different issue. I knew, however, that it would all be in vain. The Eastern Palace carriage was waiting outside. Once I boarded, the journey went off without a hitch. Soon I saw Yen Sun. He looked so happy to see me that he didn't even mind his wounds. "Lu Zheng," he greeted. I nodded slightly and replied in a detached tone, "Your Highness." He hesitated for a moment, then signaled for everyone to leave until the room was empty except for the two of us. Finally, he asked, "Lu Zheng, you've returned too, haven't you?" I looked at him and said, "Yes." He seemed a bit panicked. "Lu Zheng, please listen to my explanation. I didn't fail to save you, it was Lu Yuner. She was wearing your clothes, and I thought it was you." "My clothes?" He nodded and continued, "That outfit was specially made for you by an embroiderer. But one of the maids misunderstood and delivered it to Lu Yuner's room. In the chaos, I couldn't see your faces clearly and had to identify you by your clothes. I never expected this." His voice broke as his eyes filled with tears. "I never meant to be the cause of your death." I opened my mouth, unsure where to begin. Though it was just a misunderstanding, the earlier quarrels, the cold stares, they were all real. His betrayal was real, and the injustices I suffered were real. They couldn't simply be brushed aside. Bitterly, I said, "Your Highness, our fate has ended. Don't force what isn't meant to be." After saying that, I bowed slightly and began to step back. But he suddenly stopped me. "I'm going to force it. Lu Zheng, I know you harbor resentment. I'll have Lu Yuner give you a proper account," he said, his eyes turning ice cold. I wasn't sure what he planned, but I suspected it had something to do with the fake Lu Yuner. Sure enough, a few days later, the fake Lu Yuner vanished. The very heavens over the capital were about to change. The Mid-Autumn Festival arrived as promised. The emperor held a grand banquet, and the entire nation celebrated, both to honor the festival of reunion and to mark the crown prince's full recovery. During this period, Yen Sun had assisted the emperor with countless matters, each executed flawlessly and impeccably, winning the emperor's deep favor. The emperor, raising his wine cup, looked elated. But soon, his cup slipped from his hand and fell, and he staggered backward. He desperately tried to raise his hand, but to no avail. Meanwhile, the ministers below were as silent as frozen crickets, too fearful to rise in protest. Yen Sun casually finished a cup of wine, then rose and steadily walked toward the emperor. He studied the old emperor on the dragon throne carefully. "Father, you are getting old." The emperor stared at him in disbelief, his eyes wide. A hoarse sound escaped his throat, and he looked utterly enraged. "An army of 100,000 has already assembled outside the city." He turned and addressed the assembled ministers. The sensible ones immediately knelt, exclaiming, "Hail to the new emperor." The rest exchanged glances, and eventually, all knelt down. I, however, remained seated unmoving. My father tugged at my sleeve. "Lu Zheng, kneel down now." But before he could finish, Yen Sun came over to me. He extended his hand toward me, his eyes full of hope. "Lu Zheng." I looked up and said, "Yen Sun, what you're doing is treason." He burst into laughter, as if he'd heard a joke. "Treason? I only believe in the saying, winners write history. Lu Zheng, everything I've done has been for you. If you're willing." "She's not willing." Then Yen Jin, accompanied by several men, strode in. He shot me a withering look, a glance that conveyed both displeasure and a trace of wounded pride. Yen Sun frowned. "Prince Jing, why are you meddling in the capital when you should be minding your own business?" "Of course I'm here to stop you," Yen Jin retorted. Yen Sun laughed again. "Stop me? With you?" Yen Jin nodded. "I can't do it, so what about her?" He clapped his hands, and from the shadows emerged a slender, tall figure who finally stopped in front of Yen Sun. Lu Yuner, weren't you dead?" The real Lu Yuner sneered contemptuously. "Thanks to your highness, I'm still very much alive, living for my father, for the 5,000 soldiers on the frontier, and for the thousands of souls you've sent to their deaths." "How dare you?" "Guards," Yen Sun bellowed. But no one came. "Guards," I said, "come." Lu Yuno laughed. "Crown Prince, the 100,000 troops under your command are my Lu family army, trained with my father's blood, sweat, and tears. And on what grounds do you think that once I appear, they'll continue to follow your orders?" Back then, you colluded with the enemy and committed treason. My father discovered it, but because you were young, he covered it up for you. Yet you joined forces with the enemy, luring my father and 5,000 troops into a trap. Over 70 members of the Liu family lost their lives, and more than 5,000 of our soldiers perished on the frontier. By heaven's grace, I clawed my way out of that sea of corpses and blood. I, Liu Yun'er, have come today to take revenge on you. She raised her sword and charged directly at Yan Sun, but he dodged her attack. It's all fake. Everything is fake. Guards, seize them all. Yan Sun completely lost his mind. Cornered by Liu Yun'er, he collapsed onto the ground. All the traitors were captured and thrown into prison. The imperial physicians rushed forward to examine the emperor, but he had been poisoned too deeply. Even if his life were saved, he would never speak again. Yan Jin then assumed regency. All these events were intertwined like a mess of unruly threads, impossible to separate or sort out. It had been several days since Yan Sun awoke. Ever since our last meeting, I hadn't seen him, until now when he summoned me. Emotionally, he had saved my life. Logically, he is the crown prince while I am merely a minister's daughter. No matter what, I had to see him. I prepared myself at home, and my mother saw me off at the door. She looked genuinely happy. Ah, Zheng, I can tell that His Highness truly cares for you. After everything you've been through, don't be unreasonable. I wanted to tell her that saving my life was one thing, but breaking off the engagement was entirely different, but I knew it was useless to try. The Eastern Palace carriage was waiting outside. Once I boarded, the journey was smooth. Soon I met Yan Sun. He was so happy to see me that he barely paid attention to his wounds. Liu Zheng, he greeted. I nodded slightly and replied in a detached tone, Your Highness. He hesitated, then signaled for everyone to leave until only the two of us remained. Finally, he asked, Liu Zheng, you've returned too, haven't you? I met his gaze and said, Yes. He became a bit agitated. Liu Zheng, please listen to my explanation. I didn't fail to save you. It was Liu Yun'er. She was wearing your clothes, and I thought it was you. My clothes? He nodded. That outfit was specially made for you by an embroiderer, but one of the maids misunderstood and delivered it to Liu Yun'er's room. In the chaos, I couldn't see your faces clearly and had to rely on the clothes to identify you. I never expected this. His voice broke, and his eyes filled with tears. I never meant to cause you harm. I opened my mouth, unsure of what to say. Though it was just a misunderstanding, the earlier quarrels, the cold stares, they were all real. His betrayal was real, and the injustices I suffered were real. They couldn't simply be erased. Bitterly, I said, Your Highness, our fate is over. Don't force what isn't meant to be. After speaking, I bowed slightly and began to step back. But he suddenly stopped me. I'm going to force it. Liu Zheng, I know you harbor resentment. I'll have Liu Yun'er give you a proper account, he said, his gaze turning ice cold. I wasn't sure what he planned, but I suspected it had something to do with the fake Liu Yun'er. Sure enough, a few days later, the fake Liu Yun'er vanished. The very skies over the capital were about to change. All the events were tangled together, an inextricable mess. It had been several days since Yan Sun awoke. Since our last meeting, I hadn't gone to see him, but now he summoned me. Emotionally, he had saved my life. Logically, he's the crown prince while I'm merely a minister's daughter. No matter what, I had to see him. I got myself ready at home, and my mother escorted me to the gate. She seemed delighted. Ah, Zheng, I can tell that His Highness truly cares for you. After everything that's happened, don't be unreasonable. I wanted to tell her that saving my life was one matter, but breaking off the engagement was another, but I knew it would be pointless. The Eastern Palace carriage waited outside, and once I got on, the ride was smooth. Soon enough, I met Yan Sun. He was so happy to see me that he barely noticed his injuries. Liu Zheng, he greeted warmly. I nodded slightly and replied coolly, Your Highness. He paused, then signaled for everyone to leave until the room was empty except for the two of us. At last he asked, Liu Zheng, you've returned too, haven't you? I looked at him and said, Yes. He became somewhat flustered. Lu Zheng, please listen to my explanation. I didn't fail to save you, it was Lu Yuner. She was wearing your clothes, and I mistook her for you. My clothes? He nodded. That outfit was specially made for you, by an embroiderer. But a maid misunderstood and delivered it to Lu Yuner's room. In the chaos, I couldn't see your faces clearly and had to rely on the clothes to identify you. I never expected this. His voice choked as his eyes filled with tears. I never meant to kill you. I opened my mouth, not knowing where to begin. Though it was a misunderstanding, the previous quarrels, the cold stares, they were all real. His betrayal was real, and the grievances I endured were real. They couldn't simply be wiped away. Bitterly, I said, Your Highness, our fate is over. Don't force it. After speaking, I bowed gracefully and began to step back. But he suddenly blocked my path. I'm going to force it. Lu Zheng, I know you still hold grudges. I'll have Lu Yuner give you a proper explanation, he said, his eyes turning ice cold. I wasn't sure what he intended, but I guessed it had something to do with the fake Lu Yuner. And sure enough, a few days later, the fake Lu Yuner disappeared. The very heavens over the capital were about to change. Beneath the dungeon of the Eastern Palace, I encountered the fake Lu Yuner. She had been tortured by Yen Sun until she was barely human. When I saw her, her eyes were completely blind. Apparently, she had mistaken me for Yen Sun and began shouting at me. Yen Sun, if you treat me like this, those treasonous letters will soon reach the Emperor's hands. I advise you to let me go. If not, even in death I'll drag someone down with me. She ranted for a long while, and when I remained silent, she suddenly snapped. Who are you? It's me, Xia Lu Zheng. I simply murmured a soft Then, sobbing, she crawled toward me, pleading, Xia Lu Zheng, please save me. I beg you. I'm sorry, I truly am sorry. I won't fight you over the crown prince anymore. Please save me. Her legs had been shattered and now dragged along the floor. The wounds on them had rotted and oozed pus, emitting a foul stench. Inside, I felt only a deep, bitter regret, yet I had no sympathy for her. From her, I learned that originally Yen Sun had devised a plan to kill General Lu, but the fake Lu Yuner discovered everything. She was once a tea-picking girl who, out of pity, was taken in as an adoptive daughter by General Lu. Yet, her greed knew no bounds. Even after learning of Yen Sun's scheme, she kept silent, watching General Lu march to his death without a word. After his death, she obtained the letters between Yen Sun and the enemy state and used them to blackmail him. Unable to refuse, Yen Sun had no choice but to present her as Lu Yuner and bring her back to the capital. Until the whereabouts of those letters were uncovered, Yen Sun had to placate her in every matter. But then he was reborn. I suspect that after I died in my previous life, Yen Sun, in his bid for revenge on my behalf, found some way to recover those letters. That rebirth gave him the confidence to deal with Lu Yuner without fear. After leaving the Eastern Palace, I met Yan Jin at the gate. He was sitting in a carriage and called out, "Care for a drink?" Feigning thoughtfulness, I nodded. We returned to Tingyan Pavilion, though I hadn't expected that by a drink he meant a cup of tea. He handed a cup of tea to me. "What tea is this?" I asked. "This tea is called friendship tea." I couldn't help but laugh. The tea was fragrant and left a pleasantly lingering sweetness on my palate. "Now, what do you plan to do with the fake Lu Yuner?" I asked. He tapped the table with his hand and replied, "Naturally, we'll let the real Lu Yuner handle her." I nodded. The room fell silent. Yan Jin and I had long reached an understanding. His departure from the capital originally had been a mere diversion. We had suspected Yen Sun's misdeeds all along. That's why we had taken precautions, secretly smuggling the real Lu Yuner out of the city. Yan Jin brought her back to his own fief, enlisted a renowned doctor to tend her wounds, and began gathering evidence from every side. The one in the dungeon was a carefully chosen substitute. The breakthrough in the case lay with Yen Sun himself. I deliberately lured him out. When he mentioned making me wait, I deduced that he held incriminating evidence against the fake Lu Yuner. So I arranged for an assassin to spring his trap, hoping to reforge our connection. But I never expected that he would risk his life to save me. Nor did I foresee that even heaven would be on my side. He was reborn. Perhaps, remembering the past, Yen Sun, now emboldened, swiftly dealt with Lu Yuner and couldn't wait to launch a palace coup. I had already sent Yen Jin the letters, which is why he appeared just in time. Later, I went to the dungeon to see Yen Sun. When he saw me, he hurriedly rose and came over. "Li Luzheng," he stammered. "It's good you still came to see me," he continued, talking to himself. "What changed? My very first wish was to marry you, so why now? It seems I desire more and more." He covered his face with his hands as tears slid between his fingers. After a long while, he cautiously looked up at me and asked, "Luzheng, will you forgive me?" The intensity in his eyes was overwhelming. But I shook my head. "Yen Sun, the pain you inflicted is real. Do you know the agony of almost drowning? The person who mattered most was right there, yet they chose to save someone else instead." I remember the icy lake water filling my mouth and nostrils, blinding me and robbing me of my voice. My lungs grew thinner, and every part of my body ached unbearably. "Stop, just stop. Luzheng, please stop." He managed a bitter, self-mocking smile. "I understand now." I stared at him for a long moment before turning and walking out. Near the door, I heard his voice. "Luzheng, may you have peace and smooth sailing from now on, and may all your wishes come true." In that moment, I was transported back to a summer when I was 15. He stood beneath red walls and green trees, his smile warm and gentle. "Luzheng, happy birthday. A lifetime, just the two of us, never betraying each other." In the end, though, it all turned out to be a betrayal. On the day of beginning of winter, I moved out of the Xie mansion. Back then, the emperor had granted me 3 favors. For the 3rd favor, I pleaded with the emperor to confer on me the title of commandery lady. No fief, no silver reward, just so I could leave the Xie mansion behind. At that time, Yen Jin was serving as regent. With a broad gesture, he said, "Approved." Not only did I receive a fief, but I was showered with rewards. Perhaps none in history had a commandery lady received as much as I did. I laughed and said, "That's enough, that's enough." But his face fell. "The treasury has only been half emptied. It's still early." Shortly after I moved out, my mother fell ill. A maid from her retinue came looking for me. After a long pause, I said, "Dr. Su from Yuji Hall works wonders. I'll have him see mother. As for me, I won't return. I'd only cause more trouble." After that, she never appeared again. Yen Jin, however, visited frequently. Until one spring, after I returned from spending winter in the south, I saw Yen Jin standing at the gate. From afar, he rushed over. "You still remember to come back." I smiled and invited him into the commandery lady's residence. But this time, he stood at the door, not taking a single step inside. He looked at me hopefully and said, "I've come to ask for a favor from you, commandery lady." I tilted my head. He continued, "There's a girl I fancy, but I don't know if she would agree to marry me." Gazing into his water-like eyes, I suddenly recalled a dream I once had. In my previous life, after I died, this man had broken into the capital on his own, exhausting every effort to avenge me. On the day Yen Sun rebelled, he led his troops to personally kill him. Later, he carried my coffin for thousands of miles, kneeling at every step until he reached Lingyin Temple. Already a slight man, he was reduced to skin and bones. The abbot of Lingyin Temple advised him to let go of his obsession. But he said, "This obsession has been intertwined with my very blood since birth. Only in death can I let it go." Moved by his unwavering love, the abbot granted his wish. For 49 days, he knelt before the Buddha, pleading for a favor. "Let me have another lifetime." By then, his hair had turned completely white, and he was nothing but a skeleton. He knelt before the Bodhisattva, repeatedly calling out my name. I believe that the cry I heard before my death wasn't from Yen Sun, nor from my brother, but from Yen Jin. I know that our rebirth wasn't just about me and Yen Sun, it included him, too. But I have no intention of exposing his secret. Under blue mountains and green waters, with gentle breezes and warm sunshine, I smiled and said, "Of course, I will." The end.